Hello, everyone, and welcome to this media briefing to launch the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report 2021, The Gathering Storm. My name is Rose Mwebaza, and I am the director of the UN Climate Technology Center and Network. I will be your moderator today, and I'm pleased to be speaking to you from Glasgow at COP26. The sixth edition of the Adaptation Gap Report assesses current actions to plan, finance, and implement adaptation efforts around the world. The report finds that climate change continues to outpace our efforts to adapt. So to give us more insights into what this report means for action on the ground and in the years ahead, I am very delighted to introduce to you a great panel for today's discussion. I'd like to introduce to you Ms. Inga Anderson, Under Secretary General at the United Nations and Executive Director of the UN Environment Program. Inga, you're welcome. I also have the pleasure of introducing to you Mr. Alok Sharma, the COP26 President. And lastly, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Ovais Samad, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then lastly, I would like to introduce to you Ms. Anne Ohoff, the Head of Strategy and Climate Change Planning and Policy at the UNEP Danish Technical University Partnership, who will be presenting the technical presentation. But before I hand over to our speakers, I'd like to present to you some few housekeeping rules. Our program is for 1 hour, and we hope you will spend that time with us. If you have any questions, we would like you to use the Q&A option on your screen. Please submit your questions in writing in this box. You can start right away and submit your questions, as many of you have already received this report under embargo. Please remember that when you submit your questions, specify your name and your media house or organization. So we will start our program with a few questions, and then we will start. I'd like to start by inviting Inga Anderson, the Executive Director of UNEP, to make her remarks.
Thank you very much, Rose. And to you, President Sharma, we are very grateful that you found the time to come. We do realize you have an extremely busy schedule. But I speak to you, as you just heard, from beautiful Glasgow, where the sun is shining and where we have been welcomed here the last few days. But when we look broader, 2021 has shown very clearly, in both climate impacts and warnings from science, that we must step up to cut greenhouse gas emissions at COP26 and beyond to avoid a climate catastrophe. But we need to be clear, even if we turned off the tap of greenhouse gas emissions today, the impacts of climate change would be with us for decades to come. We also need to adapt to climate change impacts that are already here and are growing stronger. With this sixth edition of the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report, what it shows is that the message still doesn't seem to be taken on board by everyone. Because implementation of adaptation action, yes, it has grown, and we salute that. And yes, adaptation is increasingly being embedded in policy and planning across the world. But the money to back such action is still not flowing at the levels required. Estimated adaptation costs in developing countries are 5 to 10 times greater than the current public adaptation finance flows. The evidence indicates that this gap is widening, in part due to a growing understanding of just how much adaptation will cost. The COVID-19 pandemic hasn't helped. The higher cost of servicing debt, combined with decreased government revenues, is likely to reduce government spending on adaptation, particularly in developing countries. The recovery from the pandemic could, however, help, but stimulus packages so far have not backed adaptation measures to any serious level. It is clear that we're not doing enough on adaptation to support and to protect not just the most vulnerable communities and countries, but also those, frankly, in wealthy countries who are increasingly finding themselves under the gathering storm. We need more finance, public and private, including through remaining efforts to help economies recover from COVID-19. We need more solidarity, we need it faster, and we need stronger implementation. We need to turn the growth in policy and planning into action, and we need to do it now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inga. It is now my distinct pleasure to welcome Mr. Alok Sharma, the Climate Change COP26 President, to make his remarks.
Well, good morning, everyone, and it's a real pleasure to join you today. I've had an opportunity over the last year to visit a number of countries, many of them on the front line of climate change, and I particularly recall being a few months ago in Barbuda, which, as colleagues will know, was hit by a hurricane, Hurricane Irma, around 4 years ago. And yes, there has been some reconstruction, but actually you stand there in the middle of the island, what you still see is derelict buildings, roofs still blown off, walls still crumbling. When I was there, I had an opportunity to speak to the community that is still there. And of course, for them, the biggest concern is how do they cope with the impact of climate change and climate events which are more ferocious and more frequent. And of course, there are people who have literally been forced to leave their homes from the island, effectively forced migration, who have not been able to return. And therefore, it goes without saying that if we want to try and reduce this sort of disruption, this sort of devastation, then we have to act. And that is why adaptation has been a focus of mine as COP president, and indeed in the year running up to this event. And for too long, we know that adaptation has been the poor cousin of mitigation. And that's why we do need to up our efforts to avoid the loss and damage today and also in the future. And one important step towards doing so is understanding the scale of the challenge. So I very much welcome this report by UNEP, and I want to thank them for all the work that has gone into producing it. And I agree entirely that we need to boost funds for adaptation, that we must make finance more accessible, and that we must align it to locally owned plans. I've championed these issues over the past year, and we have seen some progress. With Fiji and partners, the UK is leading the task force on access to finance. And yesterday, I was very pleased to launch its principles and recommendations, as well as setting out 5 pilot projects. Here at COP, we've also heard new adaptation finance announcements, including from the US, from Canada, from Australia, from Japan, from Switzerland, and Ireland. And the UK and others have committed to a balance between adaptation and mitigation finance through the Champions Group on Adaptation Finance, which was launched a few months ago in September. Yet we know there is more to do, much more. And particularly, we need more finance to support the priorities of small island developing states and indeed the least developing countries. We will continue to push these issues through our presidency, and we urge all finance providers to improve access to finance, including endorsing the principle of the Task Force on Access to Finance. Alongside this, we need to increase the finance flowing to adaptation, and we need to encourage effective and inclusive planning, ensuring that climate risks are taken into account across the whole of society. Now, governments have been working hard to publish national adaptation plans and indeed share the lessons through adaptation communications. And as a result, we now have more than 2.3 billion people across the world covered by adaptation communications or national adaptation plans. We know adaptation is more inclusive and effective when it is locally led. And so we are urging governments to endorse and implement the principles of locally led adaptation, so that as the impacts of climate change build, very unfortunately, in force and ferocity, and we know that this will happen. Together, communities, governments, and finance providers are building a safer, more resilient world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alok Sharma, for really highlighting the importance of finance. I would now like to use this opportunity to invite Mr. Ovais Samad, the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Secretariat of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change.
Thank you very much, Rose, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here alongside Inger and the COP President here in Glasgow. We very much welcome the UNEP 2021 Adaptation Gap Report. It gives us an essential snapshot of the status of adaptation planning, support, and implementation. It outlines the impacts of the pandemic on adaptation, and by indicating improvement trends, it gives us reasons for optimism. Adaptation is progressing towards a stronger national framework and sectoral coverage. This message is confirmed by our analysis of the NDCs, in which 151 NDCs included adaptation information, indicating, among many other things, progress towards more integrated national adaptation frameworks, quantitative time-bound targets, indicator frameworks for monitoring progress, as well as synergies between adaptation and sustainable development. In parallel, the momentum to define and implement concrete adaptation actions is happening through national adaptation plans, NAPs, as we all know. The indicators of progress are strong. 126 out of 154 developing countries are working on the NAPs. 30 have submitted their first NAPs, and 91 have submitted proposals to GCF for NAP formulation, amounting to $217 million. It is encouraging to see the UN agencies and related organizations collaborating and supporting countries with necessary capacity building, such as packaging proposals needed to access financing. This convergence towards a common instrument is good news for coherence and ambition, and enables benefiting from synergies and best practices. When countries take a consistent approach to adaptation, ambition, efficiency, and transparency are improved, and transaction costs are reduced. This coherence will help assess progress towards global goal on adaptation. Scaling up adaptation is a crucial part of achieving success here at COP26. And COP26 offers an enormous opportunity to strengthen NAPs, keeping in mind that one key success in adaptation is adequate financing. And last but not least, it is important to recall that adaptation challenge is also a mitigation challenge. While we have heard important announcements of ambition at this COP, the current NDC ambition might take us to 2.7 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, a number which would translate to vast adaptation challenge, which I hope humanity will not need to face. Given this, we must close the adaptation gap from both directions, and it is urgent. It needs to happen now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Anne, I would like to invite you now to please present to us a snapshot of the report before we begin our panel conversation. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Rose, and thanks to all for joining this launch of the 6th Adaptation Gap Report, produced to inform international discussions about progress and also gaps in adaptation. More specifically, this year, the report looks into an update and status of progress on adaptation planning, adaptation finance, and implementation. The report also covers a chapter that looks into the emerging consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic on adaptation. But before we turn into key findings in each of these areas, it's important to stress that the science is clear. Enhanced adaptation efforts are required to minimize both current and future impacts of climate change. In August, the first report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of its 6th assessment cycle came out, documenting that some climate change impacts are by now irreversible. Last week, we launched the UNEP Emissions Gap Report, indicating that the current or new pledges for 2030 on mitigation actually brings us on course to global warming of about 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Adaptation can reduce climate risks, but it cannot eliminate them. And as risks accelerate with temperature rise, it's imperative to mitigate strongly to keep the risks and impacts manageable, and it's equally critical to up ambition on adaptation to keep existing and future adaptation gaps from widening. So if we look into progress in adaptation planning, this year the report considers the new submissions of nationally determined contributions, of adaptation communications, and of national adaptation plans. And it does show great progress compared to last year's report. By now, almost 80% of all countries have at least one national level adaptation instrument in place. 9% of the countries that don't currently have a planning instrument in place is in the process of developing one, and more than 65% of countries have one or more sectoral plans, while more than 26% of countries have one or more subnational planning instruments in place. If we look at indicators of adequacy and effectiveness, which will be important for the upcoming global stocktake, there's still no consensus on how to assess this. But the report looks into 4 areas, 4 criteria that are important in this context. And these are comprehensiveness, inclusiveness, implementability, integration, and monitoring and evaluation. And we do see progress in almost all areas. A lot of this is incremental rather than significant, but we do see significant progress in areas such as gender inclusiveness and also under implementability, especially related to regulations, incentives, and investments. Monitoring and evaluation is still a concern. Only 26% of countries currently have a system for monitoring and evaluation in place. And while another 36 are in the process of developing such a system, we also see that especially the area of evaluation is lagging behind. When we turn to the status and progress on adaptation, finance, and costs, the picture is a bit more mixed. The estimated adaptation costs and finance needs in developing countries are estimated to be increasing. We see that adaptation finance needs, as indicated in countries' submissions, 3/4 of the finance needs relate to 4 sectors: agriculture, infrastructure, water, and disaster risk management. We've also seen an increase in adaptation finance flows up to 2019, but there are signs that these are stabilizing or even declining in the wake of COVID-19. At the same time, there are signs that adaptation costs at the higher ends of the band that has been estimated and included in the Adaptation Gap Report since 2016. So all in all, this indicates that there is likely to be a widening adaptation finance gap. If we look at the total climate finance for both adaptation and mitigation, the flows reached just under $80 billion in 2019, so about $20 billion short of the $100 billion pledge or goal. Turning to implementation, we see that implementation of adaptation actions is growing. The top 10 bilateral donors funded more than 2,600 projects with a principal adaptation focus since 2010. And we also see that there has been an increase, although the results have been somewhat mixed over the past 4 years, in the number of new adaptation projects started. However, at the same time, there's been an increase in the project size, with more projects now of above $10 million. But if we take into account that risks and impacts are increasing, the finance gap might be widening, there is an urgent need to scale up implementation levels to avoid falling behind further, especially in developing countries. Finally, we look into the emerging effects of the COVID-19 pandemic for adaptation. And first of all, we see that only a very small portion of the $16.7 trillion that has been allocated globally for fiscal recovery and rescue measures has targeted adaptation. We've seen, especially in developing countries, that COVID-19 restrictions have impeded disaster response efforts. And we also see that economic and social impacts affect vulnerable groups disproportionately. At the same time, this has been accompanied by heightened costs of servicing debt and decreased government revenues. It's not all bad, though. There are lessons of the COVID-19 pandemic that can be used to improve the situation. First of all, governments can address compound risks through integrated risk management approaches. There are plenty of opportunity to use the fiscal recovery measures to address both social, economic, and climate change concerns and priorities. And finally, there is room to establish flexible disaster finance frameworks. So all in all, despite some progress, further ambition is needed. We need to up the establishment of monitoring and evaluation systems. We need to scale up public finance. We need to have stronger and more implementation of adaptation actions. And we need to look into the opportunities for using the fiscal recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic to prioritize both economic growth, climate resilience, and other priorities. And finally, advanced economies can play a crucial role in helping developing countries to free up fiscal space for green and resilient COVID-19 recovery efforts through concessional finance and substantive debt relief. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you to our panelists. We are at that portion in our discussion where I present to you some of the questions we've received in advance from the media, and some will be coming in. I will let all of you address them as you would see fit, and I'll start with the first one from Reuters. The question is from Bay, and Bay asks, could I get a short comment on how the rising cost of servicing debt among developing countries could worsen the adaptation finance gap?
If I may.
Yes, please.
Obviously, as countries' fiscal space has been squeezed, as economies have been under strain in view of COVID, it has been very difficult for a number of countries just to meet their normal fiscal burden, in addition to the health burden, in addition to the social cost of supporting people who are no longer working, in addition to the loss of revenue from otherwise vibrant businesses. So looking at that then, there is very little fiscal space in this context, therefore, to allow for additional expenditure on adaptation. And so as we have seen with a greater intensity, the storms, the fires, the inundations, the droughts, that is obviously a concern. And so there, clearly, where the debt burden is very high, and that's what we've seen in a number of countries, and I think Prime Minister Mia Mottley has been one of the most outspoken on the issue of small island states that are no longer eligible to borrow at concessional levels, but actually are borrowing at full cost levels. But they are yet, these countries are on the forefront of the climate impacts and are not even, they may have, their tourism sector has been impacted too by the lockdown and COVID. So not only are they unable to find concessional finance, not only have they been hit, not only are they on the front line of climate impacts, they are really squeezed from all sides. That is why finding new ways of enabling finance to these countries and more will become absolutely critical.
Ovais, do you want to comment on how this is impacting developing countries?
Thank you, Rose. No, I think that's a very relevant question. When the costs, the rising financial cost, that certainly has a negative impact on adaptation plans. From our perspective, what we would like to see is that that would trigger a reprogramming and then resubmitting the plans and project proposals to the relevant funding organizations. And we certainly, together with UNEP, can help developing countries in that reprogramming, resubmission of the proposals, which happen because of extenuating circumstances that are beyond anyone's control because of rising debt, financing costs, as was said, and the servicing of debt. So that is absolutely clear, critical, and we would be ready to support.
And maybe if you could add as well to that question, an additional answer to what some of the solutions could be. This is something also Bay has asked that we address.
I don't think I have much to add to what's been said already on this question.
All right.
We could add in terms of, I mean, clearly there are a number of investments that countries need to make. And one of the bigger opportunities is really to investing in nature's infrastructure. We last year launched a decade of ecosystem restoration, and that is not just for one thing, one benefit or another. It really has a multitude of benefits. It can provide local income. It can enhance gender equity because often women are dealing with some of the forest food or other closer to home revenue opportunities from nature. It can certainly sequester carbon, or blue carbon for that matter. And so finding a way as we invest in resilience, yes, we need to invest in smart, hard infrastructure, but at the same time, we very much need to invest in future-proof cities, future-proof coastlines, future-proof villages, etc. And what we are seeing, of course, is the more we are kicking the mitigation can down the line, the more we are likely to see greater costs on the adaptation side. So what Ovaise was saying, the Deputy Secretary was saying, is so critical that recasting the plans to meet those imperatives becomes critical.
I think that is an important point at which to address the second question from DW, where they want an elaboration on how some of these COVID stimulation packages could be an opportunity to mitigate the spending gap on adaptation.
If I can start on that, I think we've said it numerous times that COVID provides an enormous opportunity to build back better, it has been said, or build forward better. So definitely there is that opportunity, and the message has been communicated absolutely in a clear format to all the governments, funding agencies, that the COVID funding, as important as it is in an emergency, but add another step in that process of investing that funding to look at whether it is being invested in a sustainable, responsible manner that helps, in particular, adaptation. And that has to be done, and we should remind all decision makers of that responsibility.
And just to add to what was just said, I mean, I have the privilege and pleasure of living in Kenya, the only global headquarters of the UN in the South, in the global South. And there we've been seeing some quite, and as an example, since it's my host country, we've been seeing some innovative expenses that the government of Kenya has done towards precisely as part of getting people back to work, planting trees, fixing parks, etc. Or we could mention what happened recently in Pakistan, where also a significant World Bank project, as I understand it, was enabling restoration under the billion 3 tsunami. And by planting trees, people got money in their pockets. So it was a good COVID stimulus for the economy, but it was also with payback to the environment.
And you want to add something from the work you've done on the report?
Yes, and it's actually also drawing on the emissions gap report, where we also look into how is the fiscal recovery measures, how is the money being spent. And I think in this context, it's important to note that the fiscal space and the fiscal recovery is way smaller in developing countries than it is in developed or high-income countries. So on average, $12,000 is being spent in fiscal recovery and rescue measures in the global north, in rich countries, whereas that number is $60 per person among low-income countries. So whereas we don't see a lot of the funding going into either low-carbon development or climate resilience, it's also a matter of the size of the funding. So I think that's an important point to make, that we need to be able to enable countries in the Global South to recover better.
Okay, and the next question I have is from the South African Broadcasting Corporation. And they want some further elaboration on why it is that the impacts of climate change are far outpacing the efforts to adapt to them according to the findings of the report that have just been presented. Yes, please.
So what we see is, first of all, as several have also mentioned, is that the finance is not flowing as quickly and as much as it should be to address even current adaptation gaps. That's one reason. Lower finance available limits the ability to actually address existing adaptation gaps. We also see that there's a huge correlation, a very strong correlation between adaptation and development in general, which underlines the need to make integrated approaches to addressing both development priorities and adaptation and resilience priorities. So that's at least two major points. And then, of course, that science has moved forward. It shows us that impacts are happening at lower degrees of warming and more ferociously than we previously thought. So that's also accelerating.
And I have an interesting one as well from Israel. And they ask, why do middle and high income countries, what do middle and high income countries need to do to adapt better, apart from giving resources to poor countries? After all, it didn't look like the US, France, Germany, or China were prepared these past months for the droughts and floods they've experienced.
No, that's a very important and timely question, and I can speak from, we are, as you know, hosted by the German government in Bonn, and not very far from where we work and live. We've seen some very serious devastation in the recent flooding. And now how to prepare for that is to do everything that is possible upstream to make sure that those areas are protected. There's early warning systems that need to be put in place, and the recovery needs to happen, as we said, in a responsible and safe manner. And what we've also seen is that insurance companies have distanced themselves from these zones which are low-lying or vulnerable to such climate impact. So they need to be brought back to the table, and they cannot get away from their responsibilities to providing that insurance that is very much needed. So there are multiple areas that we need to look at and engage all the different stakeholders to prepare for this. And we have all the tools and the experience from all parts of the world, north, south, and so we need to take that on board and make sure that that is fully implemented in the planning.
Maybe I'll just add to this that, I mean, whilst obviously poorer nations take a much bigger hit, poorer people are obviously on the forefront of the receiving end of the impacts of climate change, but this is going to come to everyone's shores. This will hit us in the cities on the 22nd floor as it would hit us in the slums of any country that has a large degree of poverty. The fact here is that no country is isolated, and in fact, when we heard speakers at the opening speak about how the vaccine how COVID affects us all, climate change. If I have climate change, you have climate change. It is not something that is isolated within the borders. So that would be the first point. Another point, of course, is that, and you mentioned insurance, and I'm very glad you do, because obviously insurers cannot shirk their responsibility. But what we will see, and what we are already seeing as what were catastrophic risks that could occur once in a century, and therefore insurance could be, if they are every year, no insurer will take it. And so we need to understand that long term, we have to invest in resilience, invest in mitigation, and invest in adaptation, or move. and the latter is obviously not an option, which is why this report is so critical, because whilst we talk about the gap, the adaptation gap in terms of finance, that gap is widening. We heard from Anne Olhoff, and we need to understand that the longer we wait, the more expensive it will be.
So I have two questions, one from ARD Germany and one from The Guardian. I will start with the one from Germany. The question from Rosario is, what measures will it take to control drought brought on by changes in climate in Kenya and in the Horn of Africa at large?
Maybe I will start on that one. But obviously, when Kenya declared a drought emergency and said that 2 million people were exposed and at risk, this is no small thing. Mm-hmm. And when that is so, and remember, please, that comes a year after devastating locust infestation, mm-hmm. we are seeing something nearly of biblical proportions here. And so it will take adaptation to a new reality, even if we manage today to halt CO2 emissions. That reality is here now. And therefore, that will include, water storage investments, crop adaptation, enhanced, the irony is that some parts of Kenya has flooding while others have extreme drought. Adaptation to what you grow, where, and how. And let's be honest, if we move beyond Kenya into the Sahel, it's also about ensuring that, that communities can have the degree of stability to enable, to avoid the conflicts between herders and agriculturalists. The African Union has stood up a very large program, the Great Green Wall, and we should not envisage just a wall, but we should envisage a desire to invest in greening of the agricultural space of the space, because that can create more soil moisture and therefore greater rainfall and higher moisture retention in the soils. This has been done elsewhere, but the program that our African Union colleagues have stood up is massive and needs significant support, but has the opportunity to begin to stabilize what we're seeing before our very eyes.
So I think I'll ask the last question. We have so many, but it's from Fiona Harvey from The Guardian. And she's interested in us talking a little bit about more the human and health impacts as they relate to climate change and the need for more finance and efforts on adaptation. That is from Fiona Harvey from The Guardian.
Well, maybe we can begin with the report itself, which speaks to health.
Well, the last year's report had a focus on health and basically showing that the gaps in adaptation and health are also increasing. We also see that very little of the finance currently flowing to adaptation goes into health. At the same time, we've experienced this pandemic, which clearly underlines the linkages also between the way that we're treating nature and pandemics and risks of diseases. So those are big chunks of issues on the table there.
No, I fully agree, and recalling from my previous experience of witnessing migration in various parts of the world, the impact on human is amazing in terms of the suffering, the vulnerability. So, as we've been saying, that all the statistics, the performance indicators, and the numbers that we talk about, I think we need to measure it in terms of the human lives that we can save, we can protect, and we can get them out of the harm's way of the climate crisis that we are facing. So the health and human aspect is extremely important in adaptation.
And maybe I'll just add here that we know that, well, we're living with what is a zoonotic disease, and so We know that 75% of all new diseases are zoonosis in their origin, which means they originate from animals. And the more we encroach upon nature, the more we destroy tropical forests, the more we move into what is supposed to be remote, the more we trade illegally species that are not supposed to be traded, the more we bring together biodiversity that shouldn't be sitting on top of each other in cages, the more likely we are to have these incubators. And understanding then that climate change is an added dimension to this. So I think that the report that highlights that whilst many of the adaptation plans actually speak to the imperative of health, yet fail to invest in, to set money and identify the financing, this is an area that will become ever more important, and one that the report last year and to some extent this year with the COVID chapter, this report shines a light on.
I would like to bring our conversation to a close. We have quite a lot of questions from our colleagues in the media, but I'd like to end by thanking our panelists and the media colleagues who have joined us for this launch. I know this is a season of information overload, and so we at the UN Environment Programme are very grateful for your interest in this event. We are sorry for some of you who had some technical problems joining, but should you have any lingering questions, please do contact our details on the news media team and our press material, and please do feel free to reach out. We thank you all very much for this time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rose.
Thank you.
Wonderful to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
You doing well?